Saurabh also joins us now. Saurabh, the ATC communication by the aircraft was at 8:18 a.m. and 8:44 a.m. is when the ATC actually saw flames near the threshold. How would you explain this?
Baramati is is an airfield that's like the press release says, it's an uncontrolled airfield, which means that it does not have ATC staff manning, the air control tower like in other commercial, airports, like, for example, say a Pune or any other airport which has commercial flights landing. It has around a 1,700-meter runway. And what is very clear is that, the aircraft, BTSSK, made contact with Baramati at 8:18. And then, of course, they were given the next call was at 30 nautical miles inbound to Baramati. And then they were given advised to descend in visual meteorological conditions at the pilot's discretion, which means that this is a visual approach, that, the runway has to be in sight. It's not, a system-aided approach where, airplanes have very advanced systems that guide the plane onto the runway. This is a visual approach, Baramati. And that was what was, sort of advised to the plane. And then what we had been told is that the crew inquired about winds, visibility, and they were informed that the winds were calm. Visibility was around 3,000 meters, which means about 3-kilometer visibility, which is very normal, which is decent visibility again, if you look at it in terms of, flying parlance. And then they were asked, to report runway in sight after a go-around, the first go-around. They initiated a go-around in the first approach, which means that they could not, sight the runway properly, and they decided not to land and decided to make a second approach to land. Now, after go-around, the aircraft was asked about its position, and the crew reported on final approach. Now, when the crew say final approach, which means that they've lined up with the runway, the runway is usually in sight, and and that basically it's the the final moments before landing. And that, of course, is something that the crew were asked to report runway in sight. Runway is currently not in sight. Will call when runway is in sight is what they said. And after a few seconds, they reported that the runway is in sight. So this is the sequence. So which means this is all normal procedure. So far, things are going normally. The aircraft was then cleared to land on runway 11 at 8:43 IST. However, they did not give a read back of the landing clearance. Now, when the ATC gives you an instruction to the pilot usually repeats that instruction. For example, if the ATC says cleared to land, then the pilot will repeat that instruction so that there is no miscommunication. Again, a very common, essential practice in aviation. And this is, of course, but they did not do this read back. So that is the first anomaly. And then, of course, next the ATC saw flames around the threshold of the runway at 8:44 IST. This is barely a minute later. And the emergency services then rushed the crash site. So till about, there is, of course, this go-around. Now, go-arounds happen fairly often in aviation. It is a practice that's often initiated because sometimes you can't see the runway. Sometimes there's a runway incursion. Sometimes if the pilot feels that, the wind gust is too strong, whatever may be the reason, the pilots can choose to do a go-around. In this case, they did. And this was their second approach. And on second approach, things seem to be going normally right until the last minute.